There are many ways that you can deploy a JRuby application. In this episode, I will be demonstrating using Trinidad, which is built upon Tomcat. This strikes a nice balance of utilizing the solid Java foundation while still feeling like a traditional Rails deployment. It is also quite flexible with the many extensions it provides. This allows you to easily keep everything associated with your Rails app, including running of background jobs, all in a single process. Well, let's get started. Here is the application I would like to deploy, and I already have it set up running JRuby like I showed in the previous episode, number 376. Now I'll be deploying to a Linode VPS running Ubuntu 12.04, so let me rebuild this VPS here. And then I'll reboot it. Then once it starts up, I can SSH into it. And then I'm going to add a user, let's call him deployer. And then I'll paste in this command to give him sudo behavior. And that's all I will do for there. Now, so I don't have to type in the password every time, I'm going to run this command ssh copy ID, which I installed through Homebrew, so that it can copy over the SSH key over for that user. Alright, so now our server is pretty much set up and we're ready to deploy, but let's see what we have so far in our application. I'm going to start in the gem file. Notice that I have JRuby already set up and that I'm using Postgres for the database. Now I also went ahead and prepared this project for deployment by setting up Capistrano, which you can see in this deploy script. Inside of here, I'm loading several other Capistrano recipe files to set up various parts of the production server, and you can see that in this recipes directory. Now this technique I explained in more detail in episode 337, but there are several differences in this episode. One difference is that there's no mention of a unicorn recipe here because I will be setting up Trinidad for the app server instead. Now another difference from my usual setup is that I'm deploying via copy instead of using a remote cache through a Git repository. I'm doing this because I ran into some issues using JRuby with the SSH forward agent option. I'll put a link in the show notes that goes into more detail and discusses this issue. Alright, so this is what I have so far set up for this project, but there's more we need to do here to make it compatible with JRuby and Trinidad. The first thing I'll do is inside of the Ruby env recipe file is change the version of Ruby that's installed on the server, because right now it's installing MRI. Instead I want to install JRuby 1.7.0 preview 2, which is the most recent release. Now to get this to work, we also need Java on the server, and I'm going to install that through apt-get. I'll add the package dependency here of open JDK, and let's do version 7, and I'll use the JDK version. You might want to just install the runtime environment, but this gives us a little more flexibility in what else we can do with it. And while we're here, I'm also going to install the JSVC package because this will be required for running the Trinidad as a demonized process. Next, I need to install Trinidad, and I'll do that through the gem file since it's a Ruby gem, and I'll add it to the JRuby platform here. And I also want to set the require option to false since it's loaded in differently. Now there's a lot more to do here, but I'm going to try deploying what I have set up so far to see if it works. First I'll run the bundle command since we changed the gem file and it needs the proper log file. Now notice this included the Trinidad jars gem, which has Tomcat embedded right in, so we don't have to install that separately on the server. Next I'm going to run the Capistrano deploy install command, which will go through the various recipes and install the different parts of the server. Now if you get an error when running this command, try running bundle update highline because older versions of that gem were incompatible with JRuby 1.7.0 preview 2. So with that command finished, I'll run cap deploy setup to configure the server. And then finally, I'll run cap deploy cold to finish up the deployment. Well, this is looking good so far. Let's try visiting it. Well, when I visit the IP address, then it's going to return 403 forbidden on Nginx because I haven't configured Nginx properly and also Trinidad isn't set up and running. First, let's try starting Trinidad. I've already SSH'd into the server and changed to the application's current directory, so let's start it up by running bundle exec Rails server Trinidad and then passing in the environment and setting it to production. So after a little while, this will start it up on port 3000. And visiting that port in the browser, we get our application. It's not serving the static assets since it's not going through Nginx, but at least we know our Rails application is working without an error. Now we just need to configure Nginx to proxy to this Trinidad server. Now going to the project, I have this Nginx ERB template file, which holds the server configuration. And right now it's not doing much more than serving static assets. However, I have this comment here telling me that it needs to proxy to the Rails app that Trinidad is running. So I'm just going to paste in some code here to do the proxying. Basically, I'm just using a proxy pass to send requests over to port 3000. Now to redeploy that configuration file and restart Nginx, I'm going to run the cap Nginx setup task, which I have in the Nginx recipe file. And now when I visit the server on port 80, it's showing a Rails application because I left the Trinidad server running and it's passing all requests to it. Now I definitely don't want to run this command manually every time to start up Trinidad, so it would be nice if we had some kind of init server script to run it. Now there happens to be a gem specifically for this problem, Trinidad init services. Now this provides a command which you can run, and then it will ask you several questions and then generate an init script which will automatically start Trinidad. Now, since we're running this remotely on a server, I don't really want to have interactive questions, so alternatively, you can pass some YAML into the command and it will generate it without having interactive questions. So let's set this up here. I think it's about time to make a new recipe specifically for Trinidad, so I'll make a file called trinidad.rb, and then next I'll paste in the code necessary to generate that Trinidad init service. This is quite a bit of code, but a lot of it is taken up by this YAML configuration up here, which is basically just pointing it to various paths on the system. You might need to configure this depending on how your server is set up. And then we just have this Trinidad setup task, which ends up installing the Trinidad services gem after copying over the YAML into a temporary file. And then it runs that command with that YAML code, and then it's going to move that temporary Trinidad generated file into the initd directory, so it will automatically start up, and then it turns it into a service, and then restarts Trinidad, which will just trigger that given service. Now one more step we need to do is add this to the deploy.rb file because it's a new recipe, so I'll say Trinidad here. Now I've already stopped the Trinidad server, so we can see if this works by running cap Trinidad setup, and this will copy over the YAML file and run the gem and then generate the init script. And it looks like it finished successfully. Let's try it out. Now when I try visiting the server, then I get the Rails application running perfectly fine on Trinidad. Now the next problem I want to tackle is redeployment. What if I make a change to my application and I want Trinidad to load in that change when I redeploy? How do I do that? Well, the Trinidad service does have a restart command which we can issue, but that will restart the entire process. It would be nice to avoid that if we can. Instead, Trinidad supports a feature much like Passenger where you can just modify the temp restart.txt file, and then that will be detected and automatically reload in the new code if you do that on the server. So I'm going to add a task to this Trinidad recipe for doing this. I'll just paste this in. I'm just calling it reload so that there's no naming conflict, and this will just touch that temp restart text file in the current release, and this will automatically take place after the deploy restart task, which is automatically triggered when deploying. So let me try this out. Running cap deploy should copy over the new code and load it into Trinidad without restarting the process. Now that command just finished, and when I reload this app, you can see it takes a while to respond because the application, the Rails app, is still starting. There we go, it finally finished, and there is the updated view. Now while I was testing this restart functionality earlier, I did run into some situations where it would not properly reload the code. I'll post further details in the show notes for this episode if you do run into this problem. Now Trinidad supports two different ways to reload your application upon deployment. What we've been using is the restart strategy, which basically means it's going to take down the existing application and then start it up with the new code. However, the downside of this approach is that any user requests made to your application during this time will hang or perhaps even time out, depending on how long it takes to start up. Now, JRuby can take quite a while to boot up a Rails app, perhaps even more than a minute depending on the hardware and the size of the application, so it would be nice if our application was accessible during that time. And this is what the rolling strategy is designed to solve. It supports zero downtime by still accepting requests to the old version of the application while the new version is starting up. Now the downside of this approach is memory usage because it can take quite a bit of memory to have both versions of your application loaded in at the same time. Now this is a good option to go with if you monitor the memory and have the server to support it. So if you do decide to change it, you can do so by editing the trinidad.yaml config file. Now this YAML config is different than the one we set up for the initialization script. I will need to make this a separate file that gets loaded in each time Trinidad starts. So I'm going to do this inside of the Capistrano recipe we set up for Trinidad. I'll just paste in the code necessary. This just sets two settings. One to set the path that we want to set the Trinidad YAML file to be, and another one that is just going to contain a hash that we can convert to YAML for that configuration file. So this is just going to set the environment to production and set that reload strategy option we saw in the README to rolling. Next, I need to tell Trinidad to use this file, which I can change in this Trinidad options in the initialization config, which I'll just set a config option here, setting to that Trinidad config path. And I no longer need to specify the environment in that Trinidad options because that is specified in the config. Now the last thing I need to do here is generate that YAML config file, and I'm going to do that inside of the Trinidad setup task. So this works very similar to how we generated the init config YAML file, but this time we're just going to convert the Trinidad config hash to YAML and set that to the Trinidad config path that we specified in the settings up here. So I'll try running that Trinidad setup task, which will end up copying over that YAML config and starting Trinidad up with that. Now I can try out that rolling restart by making a change to our template, and then running cap deploy to push that change. Now that command just finished, and notice as I'm reloading this page, it's still serving up the old version as the new one is starting up. So if I wait a while and reload the page again, there is the new version. Now if you're doing zero downtime deployment like this, watch out for database migrations that are incompatible. Check out episode 373 for details on that. Now one topic I have yet to mention so far is multi-threading. This is in my opinion one of the main benefits of using JRuby. It has much better support for threading as I showed in the previous episode. Now currently this application is not marked as thread safe. You can see that here in the production config file, the thread safe mode is commented out. Now the way Trinidad behaves in this scenario is it will start up multiple instances of the application and run them all within the same process and load balance between them. This allows multiple requests to come in concurrently, however it's not very efficient with the memory. However, if I enable thread safe mode by commenting this out, Trinidad will automatically detect this and only run one instance of the application and use a separate thread for each request that comes in. This is much more efficient because all requests can share the same pool of memory and it can scale to handling many more requests concurrently. Now, if you're doing this, make sure the rest of your application is thread safe. I go into more detail on how to do that in episode 365. Now to deploy the thread safe mode to the server, I'm just going to redeploy the application and also restart Trinidad so that it picks up that configuration change. Now even though Trinidad automatically detects the thread safe mode in a Rails app, you might also want to configure it manually just in case the auto detection doesn't work. Perhaps you upgrade to Rails 4 and that behavior changes a little bit. To do this, you can go into the Trinidad recipe and add a configuration option here into the hash called JRuby max runtimes and set this to 1. So this will ensure Trinidad doesn't boot up more than one instance because we're in thread safe mode. I believe the default here is 5 instances. Now an episode on Trinidad wouldn't be complete without talking about extensions. These allow Trinidad to do so much more than simply running your Rails application. Now the ones that I find most interesting are those that have to deal with running jobs in the background. For example, there's the scheduler extension, which is basically an alternative to cron. I don't know how many times I set up a cron job to trigger a rake task, which really isn't very efficient if we have a threaded environment. On a similar note, there's the threaded rescue extension, which basically runs a rescue worker on a thread in the same process. This is really efficient because you don't have to have a separate process which boots up the entire Rails application and takes up more memory to run a background job. Now, if you're looking for ways to contribute to Trinidad, writing an extension is a great way to go. I would love to see someone write an extension for Sidekick support or Q Classic or several of the other background processing plugins. Now, Trinidad isn't the only way to deploy JRuby applications. There are some other alternatives you might want to consider. One popular option is Torquebox, which feels a little more complicated to me, but is something that I hope to cover in a future episode after I get a little more experience with JRuby deployment. Another option is Puma, which is becoming a great multi-threaded server written in Ruby, so it's not specific to Java. You could run it using MRI or even Rubinius. I'll probably cover this in the future as well. And then finally, there's the Warbler gem, which is one of the simplest deployment solutions. Basically, you could just package up your entire application into a .war file, copy it to the server, and then execute it from there to run it. For me, I'm more comfortable with a full Capistrano deployment recipe, which is why I chose Trinidad, because I think it better fits that pattern, but this might work especially for smaller, simple applications. All in all, I think Trinidad shows a lot of promise for being a solid Rails deployment option. However, I did run into several roadblocks while making this episode. This is partly due to my lack of Java experience, but also I think because this is sort of a road that's not pioneered as much as some of the other deployment solutions. Anyway, I'll post details about these problems in the show notes for this episode, along with some workarounds to get around them for now. I think with the upcoming Rails 4 release and the bigger focus on multi-threaded development, that JRuby and Trinidad and other alternative servers will have a big part to play in deployment of Rails applications in the future. Well, that's it for this episode on deploying JRuby applications with Trinidad. Thanks for watching.